I'm Tom, coming to you from the International Institute for the Advancement of Sourdough Science and Research of Cleveland, Ohio, also known as my kitchen. Thank you for selecting this video. In today's video, I'm pleased to share with you an exciting new breakthrough in the world of sourdough baking, and that's something called two-stage bulk fermentation. Now, I had never heard about this before, and about a month ago I learned about this technique where you can do bulk fermentation in 2 steps. You start with a very warm dough temperature for a couple of hours and you begin the bulk fermentation method, but then you move your dough to the refrigerator and you finish your bulk fermentation in the refrigerator. I was really skeptical of this and I didn't believe it could actually work. It really does work. And the beauty of this method is that it solves the 2 challenges with bulk fermentation. One is it's very difficult to determine when bulk fermentation is done. I've made a dozen videos or more on this topic where you have to really watch your dough carefully to cut off the dough right at that perfect point when the bulk fermentation is finished. And the second challenge with bulk fermentation is that it just takes a long time. And because you're watching the dough, you have to monitor the dough, you spend a lot of time in the kitchen standing around watching your dough rise. So with this method where you start with warm dough and you finish in the refrigerator, it really solves these 2 problems because the cutoff of bulk fermentation is kind of automatic. If you get this dough into the refrigerator at the right temperature, the refrigerator will cool it down at the right point, so you don't need to worry about cutting off bulk fermentation at the end. It's kind of like you're putting it on autopilot and the refrigerator automatically cuts it off when bulk fermentation is done. The second thing this does is from a scheduling perspective, you're not spending as much time in the kitchen handling the dough and monitoring the dough during bulk fermentation. In this method, you can spend 2 or 3 hours in the kitchen and then you put the dough in the refrigerator and you come back 24 hours and bulk fermentation is done. So what this does is it opens up tremendous schedule flexibility for people who are trying to make sourdough during the week, because now with this 24-hour cycle, I can make sourdough after work. So after work on a weekday, let's say it's Thursday night, I make dinner, I clean the kitchen. Now at 7 o'clock, I can start making sourdough. I mix the dough, I do a couple of stretch and folds, I bulk ferment it only for 3 hours, so by 10 o'clock I'm done. Then I move that dough to the refrigerator for 24 hours and it goes on autopilot, it takes care of itself. I come back Friday night after work. Now I take the dough out of the refrigerator, it's perfectly bulk fermented. All I need to do is pre-shape, bench rest, final shape. That takes about 35 minutes. I put it back in the refrigerator again, now for the final proof of the shaped dough, and then I have the ability to bake that pretty much any time over the weekend. I could bake it Saturday morning, I can bake it Saturday night for dinner, I can bake it Sunday morning, Sunday night. This method provides tremendous flexibility for people who are trying to make sourdough around a busy work schedule. So let's compare this to a couple of other options. Using the standard tartine method, which I've done hundreds of times, you start bulk fermenting that dough at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 27 degrees Celsius. You need to monitor that dough for about 6 hours until it's shaped and it goes into the refrigerator. You can't walk away from it. Even though the hands-on time is relatively minimal once you get the dough mixed, you're stuck in the kitchen for 6 hours. That just doesn't work. Now, I know that a lot of people learned this method during the pandemic, myself included, and then when people had to go back to work, so many people had to give up sourdough baking because they just couldn't fit it into a working day schedule. If you need a 6-hour contiguous block of time, that means you're only doing it on the weekend, and people's weekends are busy now. So I came up with another method, if you watched the video I made a few months ago, called Post-Pandemic Sourdough for Busy People, where I really reduced the amount of hands-on time. So you do 30 minutes up front, total mixing time, no stretch and folds. And then I created a method using these unique bulk fermentation timetables that I created where you can stretch out your bulk fermentation based on your kitchen temperature and the amount of starter that you use. So you could stretch out your bulk fermentation so it ends the next morning so you can shape your dough before you go to work the next morning. But I couldn't get that math to work to stretch it out for under 24 hours. You have to get the dough temperature so low or use such a very small amount of starter that it's very unpredictable if you're trying to do a 24-hour bulk fermentation starting from a low temperature. So this two-stage bulk fermentation method gives you the best of both worlds. It gives you a fast, warm start with a little bit of hands-on time, 2 to 3 hours, like the first part of the tartine method, but then you hit the brakes on the fermentation, you put it into the refrigerator, and then it starts a long, slow glide path down to refrigerator temperature where that bulk fermentation goes on autopilot, and it finishes 24 hours later when you're back home from work the next day to do pre-shaping and final shaping. Now, I've been baking sourdough and making sourdough videos for over 3 years, and I can tell you this is the biggest breakthrough I have seen because it gives you schedule flexibility, and just like the post-pandemic method, this puts sourdough baking back in the hands of people who had to quit because they had to go back to work after the pandemic. This is really exciting. So you might be asking yourself the question, where did this two-stage bulk fermentation method come from? You may have never heard of it. I've never heard of it. I've read every sourdough book out there, or at least I thought I did. Until a couple of months ago, I received this book from somebody named Michael Calanti. Michael is the author of this book, How to Bake More Bread. Michael had a worldwide bestseller called How to Bake Bread. This is his 2016 follow-up, How to Bake More Bread, and this is his sourdough-related book. It is spectacular. Now, Michael Calanti is a baker and a teacher from San Francisco. He's set up commercial bakeries, he consults with bakeries around the world, and he's been teaching bread baking for 25 years. I had not heard of this book. I started my sourdough baking using Chad Robertson's tartine bread. This was written in 2010, and this really set the foundation for what I call the modern sourdough artisanal bread movement in the US. And most of the books that have been written since 2010 are basically a copy or a ripoff of Chad Robertson's tartine method with the warm bulk fermentation, the stretch and folds, the shaping methods. I mean, every book is basically a derivation of that book. And then this one came along. This is like a book from an alternate universe where tartine bread doesn't exist. Everything in this book is different. All the techniques are different. All the methods are different. It was mind-blowing when I read this. This is a little bit more for what I'd call intermediate sourdough bakers if you have some experience with sourdough baking, because this is also written if you're trying to start a sourdough bakery or if you want to set up a cottage baking business. This is also telling you how to set up a production schedule for large-scale baking if you want to do that. But in here was the thing that really rocked my world, the two-stage bulk fermentation method. I didn't believe it until I tried it. Here's how it works. We're going to mix the dough at an initial dough temperature of 78 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 degrees Celsius. The mixing steps take about 30 minutes. Then we continue bulk fermenting at that warm temperature for another 2 hours. And during that time, we're going to do 2 folding steps. These are not exactly stretch and folds like the tartine method. They're similar. I'll demonstrate them later in the video. Then, after 2.5 hours from initially mixing the dough, we move that warm dough, and it's critically important that that dough is still at the target temperature of 78 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees Celsius. We move that warm dough to the refrigerator to continue bulk fermenting. This is the second stage of the two-stage process for 24 hours in the refrigerator. After 24 hours, we take that perfectly bulk fermented dough out of the refrigerator. We let it come up to room temperature for about an hour. Then we shape the dough. We'll do a pre-shape, a bench rest, a final shape. You can use whatever method you prefer. Then we put the dough back in the refrigerator. Now the shaped dough goes into the refrigerator for a final proof, cold retard of 24 hours in the refrigerator. After 24 hours, we take the dough out, we score it, and bake it. Now, after you shape the dough, you could do a countertop final proof and bake it that same day. But for simplicity, we're going to assume this method with the 2 cold retards. We're doing a cold retard during bulk fermentation and then another cold retard for final proofing. This is what makes this a spectacular method for busy people, because those 2 rest times in the refrigerator give you schedule flexibility. If the book says finish bulk fermentation in the fridge for 24 hours and it takes 26 hours or 23 hours or 18 hours or 17 hours, there's very, very little impact on the bulk fermentation once you get past about the 12-hour mark. Let me show you a chart so you understand how this method works. So the way the two-stage method works is we're going to mix the dough at an initial dough temperature of 78 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees Celsius. You leave that at that temperature, and you'll need a proofing chamber to do that because you have to maintain that dough temperature for 2.5 hours, which includes the 30 minutes of mixing time plus 2 hours before it goes into the refrigerator. We're going to do 2 rounds of folds during that time. Then look what happens. The dough goes into the refrigerator at 78 degrees Fahrenheit, very warm. A lot of people think when you put your dough in the refrigerator, it immediately drops down to refrigerator temperature. It does not. It takes a long time for that dough to get down to the fridge temp. So during that time, you go from 78 degrees down to 50 degrees. That takes about 4 hours. There's still a massive amount of bulk fermentation happening in that dough. Then between 50 degrees and 40 degrees, that dough is still fermenting. You get down below 40 degrees, 39 degrees, that dough will keep fermenting, but very, very slowly. But it takes 10, 12 hours in most people's refrigerators to get down to that temperature. So you're getting a massive amount of the bulk fermentation actually happening in the refrigerator. It's this slow glide path down to that refrigerator temperature of, say, 39 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius. So what's the most important part of using this method? It's getting that initial dough temperature correct, because you're spooling up that bulk fermentation in those first 2 hours with very warm dough, 78 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees Celsius, and you need to get that dough into the refrigerator at that same temperature to make sure it has enough gas in the tank to keep that temperature high to finish the bulk fermentation in the refrigerator. So then people ask the question, they say, oh, I mixed my dough, my kitchen is cold, my dough is only 74 degrees Fahrenheit or 23 degrees Celsius, can I just leave it in the refrigerator longer? Can I add more time on the end? It doesn't work, because all that remaining bulk fermentation in the second stage, happens at the beginning, not at the end. You could leave the dough in the refrigerator for 36 hours and it won't compensate for that 4 degree Fahrenheit temperature difference at the beginning, because you didn't put it into the refrigerator with enough energy to really get that bulk fermentation spooled up. You can never catch up, unless you were going to leave it in the refrigerator for days. So you have to hit that initial bulk fermentation temperature. Then people ask the other question, they say, I was trying to hit the dough temperature because you told me it's so important and I overshot the target. Now my dough is at 83 degrees Fahrenheit or 28 degrees Celsius. What do I do about that? Is that going to screw up the method? The beauty of this method is that once you get that into the refrigerator kind of self-corrects if you overshoot the initial dough temperature. It's still going to drop down to that 50 degrees Fahrenheit pretty quickly, 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So you have a little bit of leeway on the high side, I would say. You could go up to 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 83 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 28 degrees Celsius, and I think you'll get similar results with this method. So I followed this two-stage bulk fermentation method a couple of times, and the loaves were spectacular. It was just amazing. But I've only done it a few times, so I'm actually going to bake 2 more loaves today in today's video, and I'll show you some of the key elements, the critical points in the method. I won't go through the entire method, really just focus on that two-stage bulk fermentation. Now, as I was testing out this book for the first few times, I posted one of my early bakes using the two-stage method in a Facebook group that I participate in, and one of the other bakers in that group said, oh, that sounds a little bit like what Trevor Wilson does. And I said, Trevor Wilson? I have Trevor Wilson's book. Trevor Wilson wrote a spectacular e-book called Open Crumb Mastery. And if you print it out, it's not an e-book, it's a book. So I have Trevor's book here. I read back through the whole thing, and sure enough, in the back of this book where Trevor goes through these case studies, this is one of my favorite parts of the book. These aren't really specific recipes. These are actual bakes where he adjusts and modifies what he's doing, and he explains why. based on his kitchen temperature, based on how the dough feels, based on his schedule. And there are two examples in here where, based on his schedule, he essentially modified his method and he did a very warm bulk fermentation for 3 hours at 82 degrees Fahrenheit or 28 degrees Celsius. Then he put that dough into the refrigerator to finish bulk fermentation, the unshaped dough. Then he takes it back out, pre-shape, final shape, back into the refrigerator for final proof. Very similar to the Calanti two-stage method, but he does it at a warmer bulk fermentation temperature, 82 Fahrenheit, 28 Celsius, and he lets it go for 3 hours before putting it into the fridge. I'm going to try this method as well in today's video. So 2 loaves using the Calanti method, 1 loaf using Trevor Wilson's approach. Now, it's a little difficult to adapt this method from Trevor Wilson to what I'd call a generalized approach, so I'm actually going to do a hybrid. I'm going to use the tartine method, the recipe, the process of mixing the dough, which is a fermentalise including the starter, then adding the salt, then doing stretch and folds. But after 3 hours, I'm going to use Trevor Wilson's guidance to take the dough after 3 hours and then put it into the refrigerator to bulk ferment. So we're going to call this the tartine method with the Wilson maneuver, which is basically follow tartine for the first 3 hours, then put it into the refrigerator, which is similar to what Trevor's doing here. If you want to read Trevor's methods, I strongly recommend this book. It's fantastic. Open Crumb Mastery. Really changed my baking style when I read that book back in 2020. So then you might ask, why am I actually doing 2 loaves with the Calanti method? Because there are actually 2 ways to do the two-stage bulk fermentation. The simple one for home bakers is what I described. There's another method in here which you would use in a commercial bakery if you have a proofing refrigerator. I actually have a cold proofer here, so I want to try this method as well. And this is where, instead of putting the dough into your refrigerator for 24 hours, we're going to put the dough into this cold proofer for 18 hours at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. So now let's compare 3 options for the 2-stage bulk fermentation method. And what you'll see is this gives you tremendous scheduling flexibility if you're trying to spread out your sourdough process over multiple days. First, we have the tartine method with the Wilson maneuver. It's basically the 60-minute mixing process from the tartine method, 30 minutes of flour, starter, and water. Then you add the salt, do a 30-minute rest. Then you do 2 hours of bulk fermentation at 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius. That's when we're going to do 4 rounds of stretch and folds. Your total bulk fermentation time from the time you add the starter until it goes into the refrigerator is 3 hours. That's the Wilson method. Our total elapsed time from mixing until it comes out of the refrigerator, fully bulk fermented, is 15 hours. Compare that to the Michael Calanti method. This is where you're using a dough proofer, a cold proofer at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. His process requires a 30-minute mixing method. You mix all the ingredients together. There's no fermentalise, no autolyse. You do 2 hours of bulk fermentation at a slightly cooler bulk fermentation temperature of 78 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees Celsius. That gives you a total of 2.5 hours from when you mix the dough until it goes into the cold proofer. Goes into the cold proofer for 18 hours at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. Now my total elapsed time from mixing until it comes out of the proofer is 20.5 hours. The Calanti method using the refrigerator, same mixing process, 30 minutes, 2 hours at the warm temperature, so that's 2.5 hours. But now we're not using a cold proofer, we're using the refrigerator, 39 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius. So now my total elapsed time from mixing until I take the dough out of the refrigerator for shaping is 26.5 hours. So look at the scheduling flexibility that you get with these 3 methods. And as I mentioned earlier, once that dough gets down to the refrigerator temperature, you have a lot of latitude around when to take that dough out for pre-shaping. You could add or subtract 2 or 3 hours to these total times in the refrigerator, and it's not going to materially change the outcome of the loaf. So now we're set up with our 3 loaves for the experiment. Number 1, the tartine loaf with the Wilson maneuver. Number 2, the Calanti loaf going into the cold proofer. And number 3, the Calanti loaf going into the refrigerator. So what you can see we've done here is we have two different ways of doing the first stage of the two-stage bulk fermentation. That's the warm part. And we have three different ways of doing the stage 2 of the bulk fermentation. That's the cool part. This is a robust test that'll give us a lot of information about how this method works. Here's the recipe that I'm following today for these 3 loaves. I'll put this up on the screen. You can pause here if you want to look at this in more detail, but I'm using the Tartine Basic Country Loaf recipe for all of these 3 loaves because that's what I use in all of my experiments. So this will be a good comparison to other videos that I've done. So I'm using 500 grams of total flour weight. That's 90% bread flour, 10% whole wheat flour. For the 90% bread flour, I'm using a mix of Central Milling High Gluten Flour and Central Milling Artisan Baker's Craft Plus. Gives me a total blended bread flour of 12.8% protein. I use 10% Central Milling whole wheat flour to round out the 500 grams. This is a 75% hydration recipe. That's 375 grams, 20% starter, that's 100 grams, 10 grams of salt, that's 2% of the flour weight. Pretty standard recipe. I made my leaven last night. This is using a 155 leaven build. I have a cool kitchen here at night in the winter in Cleveland. So I do 1 part starter, 5 parts flour, 5 parts water. For the 2 loaves using Michael Calanti's method, loaves 2 and 3, I'm following his mixing steps exactly as he describes in here. He does a unique method of hand mixing the dough using a bench knife. I recommend buying the book. It's easier to read his description and see the photographs in the book. I'm not going to explain that entire method in today's video in the interest of time. Now, because of the different timing of these 3 batches of dough, 12 hours, 18 hours, 24 hours in the second stage of the bulk fermentation, I actually mixed the dough in reverse order so they would all end at the same time. So I did loaf 3 first, then loaf 2, loaf 1. I'm going to show you them in that order because you'll also see how I learned and adapted as I went through the process. Now, this chart shows the detailed steps for the 3 loaves. Now, this is for stage 1 of the bulk fermentation. That's the warm part. I'll highlight this chart as we go so you can use this as a roadmap, and you can pause this at any time to see where we are in the process. So one of the most critical parts of making this 2-stage bulk fermentation method work is you have to get your initial mixed dough temperature to hit that target. So in the Michael Calanti method, this needs to be at 78 degrees Fahrenheit or about 26 degrees Celsius. That's my mixed dough temperature. The way that you figure out how to do that is by using something called a desired dough temperature calculator. There are a couple of these out there. It's a very simplistic method. Here's how it works. You take the temperature of your ingredients plus the room temperature. So my flour is 72 degrees Fahrenheit. My starter is 72 degrees Fahrenheit. My room temperature is 72 degrees Fahrenheit. I add those 3 together. That gives me 216. Then I take my target dough temperature of 78 degrees Fahrenheit. This also works in Celsius. You can do it either way. 78 times 4 is 312. I subtract 216 from 312. That gives me 96. That tells me my water temperature should be 96 degrees Fahrenheit. And then theoretically, when you mix all these ingredients together, the ending dough temperature should be 78 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a rough calculation. It'll get you in the ballpark, but it might overshoot, it might undershoot. It's always better to overshoot. You want to mix your dough warmer initially as opposed to cooler, but you don't want to mix your dough too warm because that starts to stimulate the protease enzyme in your starter and it can break down the gluten right from the start. So how warm is too warm? 96 degree Fahrenheit water is pretty warm. I don't want that to shock my starter, so I'm going to use, just based on my experience, 92 degree Fahrenheit water to get this initial mixed dough temperature of 78. You can use that formula, then use your judgment and your experience. Another trick that I do, especially if I'm mixing dough in the winter, is I'll warm up my mixing bowl. So I put this bowl in my sink, I filled it with hot tap water, I let it sit there for about 10 minutes. I pour the water out, so now my bowl is sitting at 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius. So now when my water hits the bowl, it's not immediately pulling the temperature down. That gives you a couple extra degrees as well. I'm going to mix the ingredients here. So the first step in mixing is to pour the warm water per the recipe into the bowl. I then add the starter. I combine those two and mix them vigorously to totally dissolve the starter in the water. Next, I add the flour and I add the salt at the same time, so we're not doing an auto-lease or a fermented-lease or delaying the adding of the salt here. I mix all those dry ingredients together with the wet ingredients until there's no dry flour left in the bowl. Then I turn that out onto the countertop. That whole process takes about 3 to 5 minutes. Next, I cut in the flour and the water using the bench knife. This is from Michael Calanti's book. He calls this the meatloaf method because it looks like you're cutting up slices of meatloaf. This is a very efficient way to cut in the flour and the water and hydrate your dough very quickly. Then we let that dough rest on the countertop for 15 minutes. So now the dough is resting for 15 minutes, then I'll continue the mixing process. But in the meantime, I've been warming up my proofer because I don't want this dough to lose any temperature. I just took the temperature of the dough right now. It's at 78 degrees Fahrenheit or 25.6 degrees Celsius. That's the target that we want when it goes into the proofer. So I don't want to lose any more temperature here while it's sitting on the countertop, and I might lose 1 degree or so. So I'm warming up my proofer to make sure that it goes in here at the target temperature. I'm even warming up my bulk fermentation vessel in the proofer so that I don't lose any temperature on that transfer. Now, let me talk briefly about this proofer that I use. Now, a lot of you might be familiar with the Broad & Taylor proofer. I have one of those as well. That proofer only warms the dough. It doesn't cool it. And in this scenario, we only need a warmer. But this proofer from IVYX Scientific is actually a laboratory incubator that warms and cools. So the beauty of this is that I can use this year-round to control my dough temperature. I use it in the winter, or in this method where I need to raise my dough temperature above room temperature. But I also use this proofer in the summer because it can also cool your dough. So a lot of people stop baking in the summer because it's too hot and it's just your dough gets out of control when you're working in a warm kitchen. I can set this at 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius, and I can do an overnight bulk fermentation on my countertop at 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius in the middle of summer without running air conditioning in my kitchen all night. This is a fantastic unit, and I think you're going to see more of these coming out over the coming years. There's a device kind of like this called the Sourdough Home that just came out from Broad & Taylor that's a warmer and a cooler for maintaining your starter temperature. It's like a miniature version of this. This is just a larger version, but these warm and cold proofers are fantastic. Again, if you're a busy person, you're trying to work your sourdough fermentation around a busy schedule, these are incredible because you can dial the temperature up, or more importantly, dial the temperature down to refrigerate your dough, but not at your refrigerator temperature of 39 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius. You can bulk ferment dough for a long time at 70 degrees, 60 degrees, 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 21, 18, 10 degrees Celsius by using a cold proofer. Strongly recommend looking into these. This is a fantastic unit, and this is fairly small, so I can keep it on my countertop all the time. So my dough's been resting for 15 minutes now. I'm ready to do additional mixing. I take the temperature. Now we're at 77 degrees Fahrenheit, so I'm under my target of 78, which is 25.6. I'm down at 25 degrees Celsius. This is only going to continue to drop every time I touch it, move it, expose it to air. So when your temperature is lower than you want it to be, what are your options? I don't have many, but I had a feeling this was going to be the case, so I put my dough scraper in the sink in a bowl of hot tap water. So now when I touch this with my dough scraper, I'm not going to be taking warm temperature away from it. I'm possibly adding warm temperature to it. Do small things like this matter? I don't know, but it's better than nothing. I know that the temperature will only continue to go down if I don't do anything. So my bench scraper is at 102 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 38 degrees Celsius. Maybe that'll add a little heat as I do this next step. The next step in Michael Calanti's method is to build gluten. He does this by, again, using the bench knife in something he calls the zigzag method, where you're essentially stretching the dough using the bench knife. You're pulling it towards you and stretching it. I'm not really zigzagging it very well here, but I pull the dough towards me with the bench knife, then I use the bench knife to fold the top of it back over, and I continue doing that for about 2 minutes. This really develops the gluten very quickly. It does not tear the dough, and you don't want to be cutting the dough with the bench knife. So I've mixed that for 2 minutes. I take the temperature again. I'm at 76 degrees Fahrenheit, 24.4. So I lost 1 more degree. So my warm bench scraper maybe helped, maybe it didn't. Let this rest for 5 more minutes. So after a final 5-minute rest, the dough is ready to go into the proofer. We're shooting for a 78 degree Fahrenheit temperature, 25.6 degrees Celsius. Let's see where we are. We are at 75 degrees Fahrenheit or 24 degrees Celsius. So I'm 3 degrees under my target temperature. This happens from time to time. So what can I do now? The first thing to note is that the most important temperature with the dough is the temperature as it's exiting the proofer to go into the refrigerator. That's where you absolutely have to hit that 78 degree Fahrenheit or 26 degrees Celsius mark. So when I saw this dough running a little bit lower than target, I bumped up my proofer to a little warmer temperature than the target. So I'm trying to get this up to 84 degrees Fahrenheit or 29 degrees Celsius when I put the dough in to see if we can pull that dough temperature up a little more quickly. What you'll find is the dough temperature doesn't change very rapidly in the proofer, and you don't want to go to an extreme. You don't want to set this at 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius because you don't want to change the dough temperature that quickly. It'll heat up the outside of the dough, but not the inside. So it's better to do it in small increments. I also heated up my vessel, so again, I'm not losing any temperature when the dough touches the vessel. So I put my dough in. I've also marked my starting point. I know from when I've made this recipe in the past that if that dough sits down flat in the vessel, it's at 750 milliliters of volume. I like to measure the percent rise in the dough. Michael Calanti doesn't recommend or suggest measuring the percentage rise, but it's a good data point to know. I want to cover this so it doesn't dry out. I'm putting this in here and then I'll monitor that temperature every 30 minutes or so. It's been 30 minutes. Let's see what the dough temperature is in the proofer now. I bumped this up to 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit to try to move that temperature up. Right now it's sitting at 75 degrees Fahrenheit in the center of the dough. That hasn't moved much. That's 24 degrees Celsius. The edge of the dough is at 78 degrees Fahrenheit. That's our target, 26 degrees Celsius. So it's getting there. That temperature will heat up on the outside and then eventually get to the middle. So I'm going to keep this at 82 degrees Fahrenheit or 28 degrees Celsius for another 30 minutes, and it'll probably get up to the target temperature by then. So for this batch of dough, I've really gone through a lot of detail to show you all the machinations that I go through to test the dough temperature periodically and then try to modify the dough temperature with these different techniques. Because with this method, the most important skill you have to develop is to hit that target dough temperature, especially the temperature when the dough goes into the refrigerator. It just won't work otherwise. So this is very important. I spent a lot of time in this loaf going through the details. For loaves 2 and loaf 1, I'll just hit the highlights of what happened with the temperature during the mixing process because those temperatures are germane to the outcome of the loaves that you'll see here later in the video. So this is the point in the video where people say, Tom, seriously, the thermometer, the temperature taking, like, is the temperature really that important? Is taking the temperature really that important? It's the most important thing you have to do when you're making sourdough bread. I mean, I have this thermometer. I have this thermometer. Is taking the temperature important? Don't make me do this. I'll do it. I have this thermometer. I have this thermometer. I have an infrared thermometer. I have this one. This one. Here's one. Here's another one. Here's a 4-probe thermometer. I can take 4 probes of 4 loaves at once. Here's a wireless thermometer. Here's a wired thermometer. Here's another one. Is taking the dough temperature important? I think it is. The dough has been in the proofer for 1 hour. Now what we're going to do, this is from Michael Calanti's method, is we're going to take the dough out and do something called a degas and fold. This is a real unique handling method. It's not like a stretch and fold. It's not like a coil fold. It's something a little bit different. So I'll demonstrate it this one time. I've left the proofer set at 82 degrees Fahrenheit or 28 degrees Celsius. Let's see where our dough temperature is against our target. So the center of the dough is now at 77 degrees Fahrenheit versus our target of 78. So we're very much in the ballpark, 25 degrees Celsius. So I can set the proofer now to 78 and it'll maintain that temperature. Now to do this degas and fold, you want to just lightly flour the surface. I try to not use any flour at all, but this is a real sticky operation. So I'm going to demonstrate this with a little bit of flour. Now the degas and fold process is basically taking this dough and pushing the air out of it. This actually helps speed up the fermentation process when you do this early in fermentation, in bulk fermentation like this. So I want to spread this into a circle, almost like if you're making a pizza dough. I'm just using the palm of my hand. And now I actually call this the pizza fold, because if you imagined you were in New York City and you bought a pizza and you wanted to take it to go and you were going to eat it while you're walking down the street, you'd ask them to not cut it. You would take the whole pie as is, and then if you were going to fold this up so you could eat it, you would take the bottom half and fold it over the top like that. You would take the left side and fold it up like this. Then you'd take the right side and fold it like that, and you could actually pick this up and walk down the street and eat an entire pizza pie on the streets of Manhattan with this pizza fold. Then I just do a little tighten and tuck. Now, how does this compare to a stretch and fold or a coil fold? When you do a stretch and fold in the classic tartine method, you're essentially creating 4 layers in the dough by stretching and folding those flaps on top of each other. When you do a coil fold, you do that fold under, you turn it 90 degrees, you fold it under 2 more times. That creates 8 layers in the dough. This method creates 5 layers in the dough. So this is somewhere between a stretch and fold and a coil fold in terms of building dough structure. Back into the proofer, we'll keep that at 78 for another hour. And now I'm going to transfer this to a different fermentation vessel because I need to use that one for another loaf. I'm going to spray this with a little non-stick cooking spray so it comes out easily 24 hours from now. Now I want to seal this tightly because it's going to be in the refrigerator for 24 hours. I don't want it to dry out. I did not leave much headroom in this vessel because in my experience, when this is in the refrigerator for 24 hours, it might rise up to the top of this, but I don't think it'll exceed the top. If it does, I'll move it into a different vessel. Okay, that went into the fridge. I put it on my middle shelf, which typically is where my refrigerator temperature is 39 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius. You want to test your dough temperature occasionally on different shelves in the refrigerator because you might have hot and cool spots in your fridge. The process for loaf number 2 is exactly what we just did in loaf number 3 for this first stage of the bulk fermentation process. Mix the dough to a target temperature of 78 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees Celsius. Put it into the proofer and maintain that temperature for 2 hours. Do the 2 degas and fold methods on the hour mark. Then at the end of that process, where stage 2 differs, is we take that bulk fermented dough, and for stage 2 of bulk fermentation, it goes into my proofer at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius instead of going into the refrigerator for 24 hours. So the only difference on this loaf is that second stage of bulk fermentation. I'm not going to show all the details here, but what I did differently with this approach, because I undershot my temperature slightly in loaf number 3, is that I used the recommended temperature from the desired dough temperature calculator of 96 degrees Fahrenheit or 36 degrees Celsius. That gave me a little bit warmer initial dough temperature, but my dough still dropped down and I missed the target by 1 degree. I ended up at 77 degrees Fahrenheit target instead of 78. So it was closer, but I still slightly undershot it. That temperature rapidly came up to the target once it went into the proofer. Now there are two versions of the cold part of the two-stage bulk fermentation in Michael Calanti's book. There's the refrigerator version at 39 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius. There's another version that I like to do where you bulk ferment the dough for 18 hours after that initial 2-hour period at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. So not quite refrigerator temperature and not quite for as long as you would in the refrigerator. Now you need a special proofer to do this. The one that I use for my warm proofer is also a cold proofer. That's the IVYX Scientific Incubator. I can set that at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius, and I can cold proof in that for the second stage of the two-stage bulk fermentation. I also have another one that's larger because I'm still using that one for another loaf of dough. This one is not quite countertop size, but I keep this in my basement. This is from a company called Vivor. And this is a 25-liter capacity. You can fit a lot of dough in here, and you can also put shaped loaves in bannetons in here as well, and you can use this as a final proofer at different temperatures. But I'm using this for the second stage of the two-stage bulk fermentation. I set this to 10 degrees Celsius. So that's 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to let this cool down for about an hour, so as soon as that dough comes out of the warm proofer, the cold proofer will be ready for it. Now you obviously don't need to buy both of these. I'm just showing you these as examples of what's available. The beauty of these warm and cold proofers is you can use them year-round. You can keep your dough at whatever temperature you want in the summer or the winter. I mean, this is a fantastic breakthrough. I'm a little surprised that people haven't discovered these in the past. These laboratory incubators have been around for a while, but the price points have fallen recently that make these really attractive, especially when you compare them to sourdough proofers that only warm the dough. You can get one that warms and cools for about the same price. This is another proofer that I use. This is the Broad & Taylor collapsible warmer. This will only warm your dough. It will not cool it. But I started with this early on. I love this, especially in the winter, or if you make the tartine method where you're trying to keep that dough around 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius. This stores flat, then it pops up. It's very large capacity. It keeps the temperature very warm, very consistent, and it folds down easily for storage when you're done. So I don't like bulky kitchen appliances, and even though this looks bulky when it's set up, it really folds down to nothing. You can store this under your cabinets and you hardly even know it's there. Look at that. Broad & Taylor also has a product called the Sourdough Home, which is a mini version of what that fridge does. It only holds your sourdough starter. You can't really bulk ferment dough in there, but that warms and cools. That's a new product that just came out. I do not have that one yet. And while we're talking about keeping your dough warm or cool, this is another device I recently tested from a company called Sour House. This is for keeping your starter warm or cool. This is called Goldie. That name comes from the Goldilocks zone, 78 degrees to 82 degrees Fahrenheit, or 26 to 28 degrees Celsius, which is the optimal temperature for yeast to grow. Well, the way this works is you put your starter inside here, you put this on, and then you turn it on, and it'll basically keep this above your room temperature. If your room temperature is low, if you live in a cold climate, a lot of people love these in the winter. It'll keep your starter right in that preferred temperature zone. I use this really when I'm getting my starter ready for baking. Say I keep my starter in the refrigerator, for example, and I want to take it out and mix it up and kind of speed things up to build my leaven. I'll put it in here and I'll turn the heater on, and it'll just accelerate that rise a little bit more. But if it rises too quickly and it peaks before I'm ready to bake, this product also comes with these cooling pucks. You put these in the freezer, and then let's say your dough, your starter is moving too quickly, you put these on top, and you turn the heat off. That'll actually cool down your dough. So it's a little bit like a makeshift refrigerator here, but those really work. I mean, those will keep the temperature of your starter down for about 6 hours, putting those two pucks on top like that. I use my own starter jar in here. They also sell starter jars with this, which I have to give a little bit of a shout out for. This is probably the best starter jar I've ever seen. It's made from borosilicate glass. That's the glass that they make laboratory vessels out of. It's very easy to clean. I mean, it's super easy, and there are no threads around the top. and it has the silicone cap that just slips on like that. Compare that to this thing where I screw this on and I get all that gunk in my threads. Very difficult to keep the tops of these jars clean with these screw-on lids. So I strongly recommend, if you're interested in this unit, also buy the jar. Even if you don't buy the unit, buy the jar anyways. Really like those. So I keep pulling all these different gadgets out, and you're probably asking yourself the question, do you need to buy one of these fancy proofers in order to use this two-stage fermentation method? You do not. The first couple of years that I was into sourdough baking, I followed the tartine method. I was bulk fermenting my dough at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 27 degrees Celsius, and I just used my oven with the light on. So really all you need is a thermometer. Turn the light on in your oven with the heat off, put a thermometer in there, leave it in there for about 2 hours so you can really see what temperature your oven will get up to with the light on. Some of them will exceed 85, 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius. If your oven gets too warm, you just turn the light off, or you can crack the door open. But I was very successful at maintaining the perfect bulk fermentation temperature for this method, just using the oven with the light on for many years. There are other things that you can do. Some people use their microwave with the door ajar so that it turns the light on in the microwave. That's a successful method for warming up your dough. Again, using the heat from a light bulb. You can buy a little dimmable light bulb and put that in a plastic food storage container with your dough. Anytime you're doing something like that, make sure that you're not creating a fire hazard. Then you can dim that light bulb and that'll increase or decrease the temperature. You could put it in a cooler. Some people buy seed warming mats or reptile warming mats. Those are really inexpensive flat mats that you can put in a cooler or in a box with your dough to warm it up. There are many, many ways to warm up your dough if you don't have one of these proofers. Now this dough goes into my cold proofer for 18 hours at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. So that's a shorter time to finish bulk fermentation than the loaf that goes into the refrigerator, because the refrigerator gets down to a cooler temperature. This one never gets down below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. Now we're ready to mix loaf number 1. I'm doing these in reverse order, so they'll all end at the same time because they have different bulk fermentation times. For loaf number 1, I'm essentially following the tartine method, but I'm doing this at the high end of the target dough temperature, 82 degrees Fahrenheit or 28 degrees Celsius. And instead of a 2.5 hour stage 1 bulk fermentation, we're doing 3 hours at that warm temperature. And then I use this method from Trevor Wilson's book, Open Crumb Mastery, where I take that 82 degree temperature dough and move that into my refrigerator for 12 hours for the second stage of the bulk fermentation. There are a couple of other differences we're doing with this approach because I'm following the tartine method by the book. So I'm doing a 30-minute fermentolase, flour, water, and starter at that warm dough temperature, 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius. That really jump-starts the fermentation. After 30 minutes, then we add the salt. We let that rest for another 30 minutes. Then we do 4 rounds of stretch and folds up until we hit 3 hours from when I initially mixed the dough. At that 3-hour mark, then this dough goes into the refrigerator for 12 hours. Hi, I'm Tom from the future. Now, I've already had an opportunity to see what happens in this next part of the video, and let me tell you, it's not pretty. Now, it was very tempting, and it would have been easy just to skip over this whole thing and pretend it never happened, but in the interest of science and full disclosure, I need to explain to you what happened here because it's a good learning experience. Now, as you saw in the prior 2 loaves, when I mixed those up, I undershot the target dough temperature. So in this one, I was going to ensure that I did not undershoot. And the target dough temperature with this batch of dough is higher, 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius. So let me just say I overcompensated a little bit. I calculated the desired dough temperature calculation, and it told me to use a water temperature of 106 degrees Fahrenheit, which is ridiculously warm. So I knocked that down to 96 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about as warm of water as I typically want to use, 36 degrees Celsius. But what I did differently was I warmed up the bowl for a long time in my sink. So I filled this with hot water and I let it sit for about 10 minutes before I mixed the dough. And the bowl got very warm. It was 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 43 degrees Celsius. And when I started mixing all the ingredients, my dough temperature shot up, and my initial mixed dough temperature was 93 degrees Fahrenheit or 34 degrees Celsius versus what I was shooting for, which was 82 degrees Fahrenheit. So this was massively warmer than it should be. The other concern is when your dough, or particularly your starter, gets that warm, that is a red alert. You never want your starter temperature, either by itself or mixed in your dough, to exceed 87 degrees Fahrenheit or 31 degrees Celsius, because that hyperstimulates the protease enzyme, which will start breaking down the gluten immediately. You can actually feel it in your hands. I mean, if your dough temperature with the starter gets above 87 Fahrenheit, that's like DEFCON 1. That is like total thermonuclear destruction as far as your gluten is concerned. You got to get that dough temperature down. So the first thing that I did was I tried to aerate the dough. I grabbed the dough, I lifted it up out of the bowl, and you just shake it in the room temperature air, and by exposing the dough to the air, it'll drop the temperature pretty quickly. It dropped at 3 degrees Fahrenheit. It didn't get me down into that safe zone yet. So then I took the dough and I immediately moved it to the refrigerator to try to knock that temperature down. I successfully got the temperature down to 84 degrees Fahrenheit before I mixed in the salt. So in that first 30 minutes, my dough was hotter than it should have been. I finally got the dough temperature down when I added the salt, and I was able to dial it in at that 82 degree Fahrenheit mark. But the dough was moving very quickly. As I did the stretch and folds on the 30-minute mark, the dough was incredibly soft, it was not holding structure, and I could tell that I had shocked my starter with that very warm dough temperature. By the time I got to the end of the 3-hour stage 1 bulk fermentation, my dough was at that target of 82 degrees Fahrenheit, but it was moving incredibly fast. Now here at the Institute, I have the ability to travel the time-space continuum, but I can only travel one day in the future, so I'm still not sure how this loaf is going to bake up. I guess we'll find out today, or is that yesterday or tomorrow? We'll find out pretty soon what this loaf looks like. Now back to your regular scheduled programming. We basically followed the tartine method up through the 4th stretch and fold. That's 3 hours after we mixed the starter into the dough. This dough temperature going into the fridge is 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius, exactly where we want to be. This dough got off to a strong start, faster than usual because I overshot the dough temperature at the beginning. This goes into the refrigerator now for 12 hours at 39 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius. This is what we call the Trevor Wilson maneuver, basically following tartine up to the 3-hour mark, then moving it to the fridge. Here's a summary of all the temperature readings from the stage 1 bulk fermentation for the 3 loaves. You can pause here to review this in more detail if you're interested. As we've discussed, managing the dough temperature is the most important skill to develop when using this method, so I've compiled this list of my top 10 tips for managing and monitoring dough temperatures. I covered all these in this section, but you can review them here. All 3 loaves are now in the refrigerator for stage 2 of bulk fermentation. I staggered the start times of each one of these so they'll all end at the same time, and I did them in reverse order. Now as we move forward, I'll do these in the standard order, loaf 1, 2, and 3, for the duration of the video. It's day 2, and we're now finishing up the 2nd stage of the 2-stage bulk fermentation. This is the cool part where the loaves have been in the refrigerator or the cold proofer. Let's take a look at the dough. So this is loaf number 1. This is our tartine method with the Wilson maneuver. We basically followed tartine for 3 hours, then we moved it to the refrigerator for 12 hours. This dough has risen about 30%. Now, I generally don't put a lot of emphasis on the percent rise with this method because the percent rise can really vary when you put dough in the refrigerator. When you put dough in the fridge, it cools down the gases and it actually shrinks the carbon dioxide. So even though this dough is fermenting and creating carbon dioxide, the cool temperature is also shrinking the loaf at the same time. So you don't really want to rely on the percentage rise. It's just an interesting data point to note. If I take the temperature at the center of this dough, this has been in the refrigerator for 12 hours. It's sitting at 39 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius. That's exactly where we would expect this to end up after 12 hours. Now let's take a look at a chart. Now I've been using a continuous reading thermometer in these doughs in the refrigerator. So this dough started very high. Remember, we mixed this one very hot. I got the temperature down to 82 degrees Fahrenheit or 28 degrees Celsius when it went into the fridge at the 3-hour mark. Then, once it goes into the refrigerator, you can see what happens with the temperature. It took about 4 hours for the temperature to get down to 51 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. That is the rapid fermentation phase. There's a lot of fermentation going on until it gets down to that point. Then it takes about another 5 hours to get down to 41 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius. And then in the last 3 hours, it sits at around 41 to 39 degrees Fahrenheit, ending at 39 degrees, which is 4 degrees Celsius. Now, in addition to taking the temperature, I also want to take the pH of the dough. This measures the acidity of the dough. And the reason I do this is because by measuring the acidity of the dough and comparing this across the 3 batches, we'll be able to tell how much fermentation has occurred in these batches of dough. As the dough ferments, it's building acidity. You can't stop it from doing that. And by testing the acidity, you can tell how far along it is in the process. It's almost like radiocarbon dating the dough in terms of fermentation. You can tell how much it has fermented regardless of the percent rise. This dough has a pH of 4.15. I'll wait until I take the pH of the other 2 batches of dough, and then I'll explain how to compare these. So the next step in the process is we now need to bring this dough up to room temperature before we shape it. This really does 2 things. One is you never want to shape cold dough because the dough is already compressed, and by shaping it, you're really pressing more gas out and you're compressing the crumb when you handle cold dough. So by warming this up, it's going to let that gas reinflate as it warms up, and it'll give you a little bit looser dough to work with when you're shaping. The second thing that it's doing is by bringing that dough temperature back up to room temperature, it's actually reactivating the fermentation process. Because after we're done with shaping, this dough will go back into the refrigerator for a cold retard. So we want to restart the fermentation now to give it one more boost as it goes into the fridge. So I have my proofers preheated here to 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius. I'm going to put each batch of dough into the proofer for 1 hour. Loaf number 2, this is our Michael Calanti method, where we did 2.5 hours at 78 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees Celsius. Then this went into my cold proofer for 18 hours at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. Let's take a look. Now this dough, you can see, this rose quite a bit. That dough has risen 80% from where it started. And that makes sense because this was at a warmer temperature, 50 degrees Fahrenheit versus 39 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 10 degrees Celsius versus 4. So you would expect to see a higher rise on this dough. Let me take the dough temperature. This dough is sitting at exactly 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. That's right where we wanted to be. This dough was in my cold proofer that I showed you yesterday. So let's take a look at this temperature curve. If you recall this batch, we mixed it up. 78 degrees Fahrenheit was our target temperature, 26 degrees Celsius for 2 hours. This went into the cold proofer at 78 degrees Fahrenheit for 18 hours. And if you look at the temperature curve here, it took about 5 hours to get down to 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. So a little bit slower decline in the temperature than the prior loaf, even though it started at a lower starting point. So the slope of that curve is influenced by the temperature of the proofer. Then it sat at a very stable, roughly 49 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius for the next 13 hours. Let's take the pH of this batch. This dough has a pH of 3.85. That's quite a bit lower than batch number 1, which means this is more acidic. Lower pH means higher acidity. That means this dough is more fermented than the dough that was in the refrigerator for 12 hours, batch number 1. This goes into the warm proofer for 1 hour to bring it up to temperature prior to shaping. Our dough for loaf number 3 is out of the fridge. Let's take a look. Loaf 3 is the Michael Calanti method. This is really his standard refrigerator method. 2.5 hours of bulk fermentation at 78 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees Celsius, then into the refrigerator for 24 hours. Let's see what this temperature is at. This dough temperature is sitting at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Let's look at the temperature curve because this one changed quite a bit. So we put this into the refrigerator, then that temperature dropped to about 52 degrees Fahrenheit after 4 hours. That's pretty typical. In another 4 hours, it declined down to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 4 degrees Celsius. Then in the middle of the night, it went for 12 hours, and the temperature actually dipped down below my temperature setting, got down to 35 degrees Fahrenheit. That's very cold. That's less than 2 degrees Celsius. The yeast really goes to sleep at that temperature, and this was really from leaving the door closed on my refrigerator all night. Then in the morning, as I started to open the refrigerator, taking loaves in and out, making myself a little breakfast, the temperature started to rise, and this actually ended up at 42 degrees Fahrenheit. So in that last 4 hours, we bumped up again above the target of 39 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius. The percent rise of this dough is only about 20%. So it did not rise very much, but again, you can't really rely on the percentage rise with these refrigerated doughs because the gases are shrinking. Let's take the pH and see what that adds to the story. Now this is really interesting. The pH of this dough is 4.15. That's exactly the same as the pH of the dough for loaf number 1. So loaf number 1 was 3 hours at 82 degrees Fahrenheit with a shorter time in the fridge. This was 78 degrees Fahrenheit with a longer time in the fridge, and it looks like from the pH, these achieved the same level of fermentation. As I mentioned before, this pH is an indicator of how much acid is being created through the fermentation process, and it's a lot like carbon dating when you're trying to assess the age of some organic material. So this dough goes into my warm proofer now for 1 hour to bring it up to room temperature, then we'll shape it. Here are the temperature curves from the stage 1 and stage 2 bulk fermentation for all 3 loaves on one chart. You could pause here if you'd like to review this in more detail. So this is batch number 1. This has been sitting in my warm proofer for 1 hour. Now the temperature at the center of the dough, usually it takes a long time to come up to temperature. This is still at, well, this has come up about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. This is 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius in the center. The outside edge of the dough will warm up a little more. That dough has puffed up. It's a little more active looking right now. Just by warming up that carbon dioxide, it'll reanimate or reinflate the gases that were already there. I'm going to turn this on to a lightly floured surface and pre-shape. I try not to use a lot of flour in my shaping at all. That dough feels and looks really beautiful. It's holding a lot of shape. If you remember, this dough was really slack because it got off to that very warm start. So putting it in the fridge firmed it up quite a bit. Now for all of these loaves, because they're going back into the refrigerator for a 24-hour cold retard, I like to do a pretty strong pre-shaping on these because when they sit in the refrigerator for that long, gravity is the enemy. These loaves will just want to sit down, so I'm trying to build height in the pre-shaping process. The way that I do that, I just do 4 simple folds on top of itself. I pull this side up. This is really like an upside down coil fold if you think about it. Pull this side over. This dough is super stiff, partially because it's cold. There we go. So I just did a 4-way fold. I roll it over. Now I'm going to gently tighten this up. I'm not going to degas this a lot. I just want to get that into a tall round with a little bit of surface tension. I try not to do too much on the pre-shaping. That's it. This will rest for 30 minutes, then we'll final shape. For all 3 loaves, I followed the exact same final shaping method. I do a simple Betard roll-up. I fold the left side, I fold the right side, I roll the dough toward me. The dough for all 3 loaves felt well proofed and airy. You can see it here on loaf number 2. After the roll-up, I lightly tighten the dough with the bench scraper. I tuck in the ends. I turn the dough into the banneton. I pinch the seam on the bottom. A little shake. Look at that dough. That is just gorgeous dough. Into the fridge for 24 hours. It's day 3, it's finally time to bake some bread. I never thought this was going to happen. These are the 3 loaves. These have been final proofing in the refrigerator 24 hours, 23 hours, 22 hours. So I'll be taking these out and baking them in 1-hour time slots, so they will each have spent exactly 24 hours final proofing in the refrigerator. First, I want to just take the temperature and the pH reading of each one of these batches of dough. Now these have risen in the bannetons, not quite as much as I typically see my other loaves rise, so we'll see how these bake up. All 3 of these loaves are sitting at exactly 39 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius. That's right where we wanted to be from the initial plan. These sat side by side on my middle shelf in my refrigerator. I can usually maintain that 39 degree Fahrenheit temperature there. I suggest taking the temperature of your dough at multiple points in your refrigerator because you'll have warm and cool spots. If you don't want to actually put dough in the refrigerator, put some cups of water in your refrigerator and leave them there for 24 hours. Then take the temperature of those cups of water. That's what your dough temperature will be in that spot, because a cup of water is basically a loaf of dough without the flour. Let's take the pH. Loaf number 1 is a pH of 3.85. That's typically an indication of a pretty well fermented loaf. Loaf number 2 is at 3.95, not quite as far along as loaf number 1. Loaf number 3 is at 3.85, the same as loaf number 1. I put those loaves back in the fridge while I'm preheating the oven. Let's look at these pH readings and compare these to the pH at the end of bulk fermentation. So this, you recall, was when I pre-shaped the loaves. So bulk fermentation was done at the different times and temperatures, both stages. And then before these went into the refrigerator as shaped loaves for final proofing, we took the pH. Now, I've only been using these pH meters for a couple months in my sourdough baking, and I'm definitely not an expert in this field. But I have seen some patterns. Typically, when my dough comes out of bulk fermentation, I see a reading of something around 4.0 to 4.1. If you look at the 3 readings, 4.15, 3.95, 4.15, we're in the ballpark of what I would expect at the end of bulk fermentation. And that's when I'm using the tartine method or bulk fermenting at a warmer temperature without doing the 2-stage method. So these numbers imply that the 2-stage bulk fermentation method got us to a similar level of fermentation as other typical methods. Then when the dough comes out of the refrigerator after a 24-hour cold retard, I would typically see a pH reading of 3.8 to 3.85, very similar to what we're seeing here, 3.85, 3.95, 3.85. The only thing that doesn't make sense is the 2 readings of 3.95 on that middle loaf, number 2. That was the one that went into the cool proofer at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. When we took that dough out of the proofer, it looked like it had been more fully proofed. It was taller, the dough was softer, so that reading of 3.95 made sense to me at that time. But now, 24 hours later in the refrigerator, it's unlikely that the pH reading would still be the same. I can't really explain that. One of those 2 readings may be anomalous. That's a scientific term. But the only way we'll know for sure is when we bake the loaves, we cut them open and we can read the crumb, and we'll see how close these were in terms of total fermentation. Now these readings, 3.85 and 3.95, are in a very narrow range, which is interesting because we used 3 really widely different methods here of the 2-stage bulk fermentation, and it looks like these loaves are going to come out looking pretty similar, at least based on what's on paper. For each of the 3 loaves, I carefully turned them out of the banneton onto a perforated silicone baking mat. I spritzed the loaves with water and added sesame seeds. Then I slashed each loaf with a single scoring line just to the right of center. I transferred each loaf into the preheated baking pan and into the preheated oven. I baked each loaf for 20 minutes with the lid on and 20 minutes with the lid off. Here are all the details of the baking process that I followed if you want to pause here and look at this in more detail. The 3 loaves have baked and they're out of the oven. Let's take a look. In a word, these loaves look incredible. I mean, these were 3 very unorthodox methods of fermenting this dough, and these loaves look as good as some of the best loaves I've made, at least on the outside. Let's look at each one. Loaf number 1, just to recap, this is where I followed the tartine method for 3 hours by the book, 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius. At the end of 3 hours, we just stopped the process after the 4th stretch and fold, moved this into the refrigerator, left it there for 12 hours, took it out after 12 hours, pre-shaped, final shaped, put it back in the fridge for 24 hours, baked it. This loaf is amazing. Beautiful ear, opened up on the bloom. I mean, that is a gorgeous loaf of bread right there. One of my best looking loaves. Loaf number 2. We bulk fermented this for 2.5 hours at 78 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees Celsius. Then I moved this into my cold proofer, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius for 18 hours. Took it out, brought it to room temperature, pre-shaped, final shaped, then into the refrigerator for 24 more hours. I mean, a massive amount of fermentation time here. Gorgeous looking loaf. A tall loaf, a nice ear, a nice bloom. Moving on. Loaf number 3. Same as loaf number 2, 2.5 hours of warm bulk fermentation. Then we put it in the refrigerator for 24 hours, unshaped dough to continue bulk fermenting. Took it out, brought it up to room temperature, pre-shaped, final shape, back in the fridge for 24 hours more of final proofing. Very nice loaf. So in general, just looking at these loaves, there's nothing here out of the ordinary. These are all within the realm of what loaves have looked like when I've followed the most strict adherence to the standard baking methods. There are a few differences though if we look at this a little bit closer. If you just look at the height of the loaves, you do see them decline a little bit here in height, and that would make sense as we go from a shorter total fermentation time down to a longer fermentation time. The gluten starts to break down, you start to lose a little bit of height. Loaf number 1 is interesting because this has really tall shoulders, really gorgeous shape, a large bloom and a tall belly on the top of the loaf there, and a nice ear. What this loaf looks like to me compared to the others is this has more structure. When you think about the loaf structure and what creates loaf structure, these all had the same flour recipe and the same hydration. So the difference in structure is the handling that we did. On loaf number 1, we did 4 rounds of stretch and folds using the tartine method. Every time you stretch and fold the dough, you create 4 layers, but you're creating layers on top of each other. So when you do that 4 times, it's 4 times 4 times 4 times 4. We created 256 layers of dough in this loaf. That gives it that tall height and nice shoulders. These 2 loaves, we used the method where we did 2 rounds of the degas and fold. That only creates 5 layers each time you do it. So 5 times 5, we created 25 layers of dough here, 256 layers of dough here. Is there a 10 times difference in this loaf versus this loaf? Clearly not. But there is, in my opinion, a noticeable difference here. The other difference with loaf number 1 was this had the shortest total fermentation time of any of the loaves. It only spent 12 hours in the 2nd stage fermentation in the refrigerator, so it just didn't proof as long as the other ones, even though we started at that warm dough temperature of 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius. Loaf 2 kind of looks in the middle of 1 and 3. Loaf 3 is a little bit of an anomaly. I could tell as soon as I took this out of the banneton, this loaf slumped down a little bit. It's a little bit misshapen, and this is probably just from that long bulk fermentation in the refrigerator, 24 hours of the unshaped dough. Then we took it out, shaped it, put it back in for 24 hours of final proofing. It just spent the longest time in the fridge. You start to lose a little bit of your structural integrity, but that's still a very nice loaf. I think I botched up the scoring here because I did not get a great scoring line on this loaf and it opens a little bit irregularly. That's on me, not on the loaf. So when you compare the differences here, looking across all three loaves, loaf number 1, 3 hours at 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius. Loaves 2 and 3, 2.5 hours of stage 1 warm fermentation, 78 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees Celsius. Then you look at the amount of time in the second stage, 12 hours in the refrigerator, 18 hours at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, 24 hours in the refrigerator. Then we look at the handling, 4 rounds of stretch and folds, 2 rounds of degas and folding, 2 rounds of degas and folding. I'm looking at these loaves. There's no one variable that caused a material difference across all three of these loaves. All of those variables combined created a small difference across all three of the loaves. That's really the bottom line. These are all acceptable loaves, at least on the outside. Let's cut them open and see what they look like on the inside. Loaf number 1, tartine, fermentus interruptus. 3 hours after you start the tartine process, hit the brakes, put the dough in the refrigerator for 12 hours. The result, beautiful. I mean, that is a gorgeous crumb, beautifully fermented, gorgeous loaf, height, shape, the ear, a couple of smaller irregularities, even got the bunny eye in the right spot there. That's pretty impressive. That's 3 hours at 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius. Then it went into the refrigerator for 12 hours. That was the 2-stage bulk fermentation, delivered a gorgeous crumb with a 24-hour fermentation on the back end. That's a perfectly proofed loaf right there. Loaf number 2. This is Michael Calanti's 2-stage method. 78 degrees Fahrenheit for 2.5 hours. Then it goes into a proofer at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius for 18 hours. Another beautiful crumb. This one looks a little more proofed to me than the prior one. That would make sense. But look at that gorgeous, delicate crumb on this loaf. That looks like a creamy texture to the crumb. Very beautiful. Now this is what I would call a more fully proofed crumb, where you see it trending towards the small to medium size holes with fewer of the large holes that you see in an open irregular crumb. But that's a beautifully proofed loaf right there. Loaf number 3. This is also following the Michael Calanti method with the refrigerator second stage fermentation of 24 hours. That came after 2.5 hours at 78 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees Celsius. Another, wow, fully proofed loaf. This one is not overproofed. When you really see this from the inside, I was expecting this to be more overproofed. That's really a beautiful, fully proofed loaf. You can see that right there. Here's the side-by-side comparison of the crumb. I mean, it's unbelievable consistency given the different methods and the different temperatures and different times that we use to ferment these loaves. I mean, it's just extraordinary. That is incredible consistency. Loaf 1 and 2 are so close. I would have a hard time telling those two apart if I didn't have the flags in each of the two loaves. Now, I also want to go back to our pH readings for a minute, because when I saw these results, I thought there was something wrong with my meter. It's easy to blame the technology. 3.85, 3.95, 3.85, which in the world of pH readings is the same, the same, the same. Now I know why. Look at the crumb. The same, the same, the same. These loaves are equally fermented. That's why the pH reading came out so tight in that range of 3.85 to 3.95. So what does all this mean? Why am I so excited about this and calling this a sourdough breakthrough? Because you have to go back to the beginning of the video. The reason I'm trying and testing these unorthodox and creative methods is because we live in unorthodox times. So many people learned to bake sourdough bread during the pandemic. When they were home, they were locked in their kitchens. You could stand around for 6 hours watching dough rise. And so many of those people loved baking sourdough, but when they went back to work and went back to their normal lives, they had to quit this incredible hobby of baking sourdough. So I'm trying these new methods to figure out a way to get those people back into sourdough baking. This definitely does it. I mean, look at this loaf, number 3. I love this because it's on a 24-hour timeline. This is where you can bake on weeknights. On Wednesday night, I spend 2.5 hours in the kitchen. I make the dough. I put it in the refrigerator for 24 hours. On Thursday night, I take the dough out, bring it up to room temperature. I spend 30 minutes shaping the dough. I put it back in the refrigerator, and then on Friday night, I can bake it. I could leave it in the fridge and bake it on Saturday morning. I can bake it on Saturday night. I can bake it on Sunday morning. This is an incredible method for people who are trying to bake on weeknights. It's unbelievable. The other end of the spectrum, the tartine fermentus interruptus. When you used to follow the tartine method, I did it 100 times, you pretty much had to stand in your kitchen for 6 hours, and you had to cut off bulk fermentation within about a 30-minute window, or you would underproof or overproof the dough. Look what this guy does. You mix the dough on a weeknight, 3 hours, you just stop after the 4th stretch and fold, you throw the dough in the refrigerator and you forget about it for 12 hours. Now, we did this test at 12 hours, but based on the way this loaf looks, I'm confident you could leave that dough in the refrigerator for 16 or 18 hours. You might even be able to leave it in there for 24 hours before taking it out to do the pre-shape and final shape. Then that puts you back on the same 24-hour timeline as loaf number 3. So the ability to put these 2 refrigerator retards in a person's schedule decouples the process, so I can do it in small chunks. When I think about loaf number 3, I call this the 7-10 challenge. This is like in bowling when you see the 7-10 split. It's almost impossible to make. It's the hardest spare to pick up. This is the 7-10 challenge that came from my brother Bob, who some of you might remember from the Sourdough Apprentice video. My brother's busy, he's working. He says he can only make sourdough between 7 and 10 o'clock at night. This method works. 7 o'clock Wednesday, mix the dough. 7 o'clock Thursday, shape the dough. 7 o'clock Friday, bake the dough. It works. 7 to 10. No other recipe in the world of sourdough baking works if I gave you that challenge. Find a single recipe that says I can only be in my kitchen and touch the dough between 7 and 10 o'clock at night, and I need a reliable method to make sourdough bread. It's right here. I did a taste test of the 3 loaves. This is loaf number 3. And you might think that these loaves would be super sour because of all that extra time in the refrigerator. They're really not. These loaves taste like a 24-hour cold retarded loaf in the refrigerator, which is what these are. And that extra time in bulk fermentation in the refrigerator does not add the equivalent amount of sourness as you would think. Now, I've done 48-hour loaves in the refrigerator for final proofing. Those are very sour compared to what I tasted here. The extra time in bulk fermentation doesn't really add more sourness, but it does add 2 things. One is it produces a more tender crumb. I mean, the crumb of these loaves has almost a creamy texture, mouthfeel to it. And the second thing is that refrigeration time during bulk fermentation produces a more complex set of flavors. It's not really sourness, it's just a rounder, more interesting flavor profile. I can't exactly put my finger on it, but it definitely tastes different than my traditional loaves with the warm, short bulk fermentation. So why is two-stage bulk fermentation such a big sourdough breakthrough? 3 reasons. 1, schedule flexibility. We already talked about this. For people who had to give up sourdough baking because they learned during the pandemic and now they're too busy, this is the method to get back into it. Number 2, warm weather bakers. For people who live in warm climates or people who give up sourdough baking in the summer, this is the way, this method is tailor-made for warm kitchens. You don't even need a proofer. In my kitchen, if I don't run my air conditioning, I'm in the low 80s Fahrenheit during the summer, high 20s Celsius. I mix this dough at room temperature, which is warm. I let it ferment for 3 hours. I put it in the refrigerator. Bulk fermentation takes care of itself. This method is tailor-made for warm kitchens. It's fantastic. And number 3, The two-stage bulk fermentation method has been around for a while, but its perfect dance partner just arrived. These inexpensive laboratory incubators, warm and cold proofer. You put your dough in here, you can dial in that temperature for the warm part and the cool part, and you can make this work with any schedule. For home bakers, the ability to warm and cool your dough is the future of sourdough baking. This is as close as you'll get to a bread machine for home bakers making sourdough bread. This is the future of sourdough baking. Warm and cold proofers with the two-stage bulk fermentation method. You heard it here first. I cannot wrap up this video without thanking my knowing and unknowing collaborators. Number one, Chad Robertson, Tartine Bread. All of my sourdough knowledge, the foundation of what I've done here today, comes from Tartine. None of this would have happened today without Chad Robertson's Tartine Bread. Number two, wow, Michael Calanti rocked my world a couple months ago when he sent me this book. So many unique things in here, and when I saw that two-stage bulk fermentation, I knew there was something to it. Michael, it worked. Number three, Trevor Wilson, Open Crumb Mastery. I read this back during the pandemic in 2020, and this really opened my mind to trying creative things and doing different things and thinking outside of the box. When you have a challenge, what are all the tools that you have available to you? Thank you, Trevor, for opening up my mind to trying different things. I also want to thank you all for sticking with me on another long video, and good luck on your sourdough journey.